Hi there. My name is Rick Clancy, and this is Dingo Talk.
What's going on, Chuckleheads? I am Carlo Guadagnino. This is the Dingo Talk Alumni Tour. My guest this week is class of 1976, Rick Clancy. Mr. Clancy, thank you for joining us. Former Professor Emeritus Clancy, I think isn't that how that works?
Well, I don't think they gave me the emeritus title, but I was very fortunate to kind of wind up my career at Bethany as a visiting professor. And I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity to give back.
Well, so that's how you ended your career. Interesting enough. We got to find out how we got there. So
Sure.
1972, how do you find your way to Brooke County, West Virginia?
Well, people have asked me that before. I grew up in a suburb of New York City called Shrub Oak, New York. And it was a pretty large high school. Mm-hmm. And I had sort of this feeling inside of me that I wanted to go to a college that was much smaller than the high school that I went to. And interestingly enough, to me anyway, as a New Yorker, West Virginia sounded very exotic. And it sort of captured my imagination. I went to one of these high school fairs at a nearby school, and Bethany was one of maybe 5 or so schools that I went around and talked to the folks at. And, they gave me a great pitch, and I loved the photographs that they showed me. And I was very fortunate to get a small scholarship and some loans. And I said to my folks, yeah, I think this is where I want to go. And, the funny thing is, which I did not expect, like I said, I went to this high school in New York called Lakeland High School. There were literally 4 kids in my graduating class that went to Bethany College, 3 of which, including myself, graduated. So I wasn't necessarily looking to hang around with kids from my high school, but it was interesting that at that time anyway, Bethany did a pretty good job of recruiting from the New York metropolitan area, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, and some of the surrounding states.
Now why, I guess my first question would be, why the feeling that you wanted a smaller school? Was it you liked the idea of the one-on-one attention and more focus, or what was it?
Well, the high school I went to maybe had close to 3,000 students. In fact, it was so big that for the first half of my senior year, we had split sessions, morning and afternoon. And then the second half, a new high school was built, and they split our class up to go to the other high school. So half of us stayed where we were, half went to this other school. So it was just really big. And I was a fair student, probably like B, I guess, type average. And I just knew I wanted something that, I could get a little more out of directionally, a little more personalization. At the time, I think like you've told me, I was interested in being a history major. But I knew they had that, but plus this sort of area called communications, which I didn't quite understand at that time, but I thought I knew it had something to do with reporting or journalism. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And it was just kind of a cool, exotic place. And frankly speaking, I wanted to get away from New York. I wanted to experience something new and different. Mm-hmm. This is 17 years old, but to me, it was like almost going to China or Europe or something to go to West Virginia. And that's what I did.
Now, give us a picture of, the fall of 1972 in Bethany, West Virginia. For those that have been to Bethany recently, what are the differences? What are the similarities? I mean, I know I've heard that a lot, where there's some things that will never change. And there's a couple of things that don't look the same.
Yeah, well, certainly the climate and the terrain and the historic buildings and structures are pretty much the same, although to some extent, some of them are facing some deterioration issues these days. Mm-hmm. But the campus, in essence, pretty much looks the same, except maybe for those Campbell Mansion or the residence halls out there by the field house. Those were not there when I was a student. But otherwise, the structures are pretty much the same, though they're not used the same way as they were at that point in time. But yeah, Bethany was a charming place. It was a small college. It's
Mhm.
actually a little smaller today than it was back then. I think in those days we had 1,000+ students, which still is pretty small.
Yeah.
And today maybe it's 500 or so or whatever. So, that's a change, and I'm hopeful with the new board of trustees and the new chair of the board and just the new spirit that I see at Bethany College, that in fact they're on their way to growing the enrollment and of course the retention, which is important.
Now, once you're on campus, it's 1970, 1972. We go into 1970, spring of 1973. Social aspects. Was there any good concerts that you remember from your time at Bethany?
Yeah, there were a lot of good concerts, but actually one of the social aspects that I did notice about Bethany, different from my high school in New York, was there were a lot of women or co-eds with blonde hair. And I found that very striking and appealing at the time. But to your question, concerts, yeah, we had a lot of great concerts. I'm trying to think. Barry Manilow was there. Harry Chapin was there. The band, I think, was there at one point in time. Gosh, there were so many. Blue Oyster Cult was there. Yeah, there was really an excellent array of concerts, and oftentimes they were bands that became famous maybe 5 or so years later, maybe 10 in some cases, but
Mhm.
somehow, well, Darlene Nicholson was the
This name.
staff member, the executive who kind of put that all together with support from some students, and just did a fabulous job of lining up these bands that were kind of on the up and coming trajectory, and it was really marvelous. Not only that, in terms of social life, there was a very active Greek life system with fraternities and sororities, and especially that first semester as a freshman, the fraternities in particular would have parties on Friday or Saturday night, and they'd all have live bands. It was
Mhm.
great, and sometimes more than one would happen on the same night. I was a KA Kappa Alpha, and I remember one time we had a house next door to the Sigma Nu house, and we both had a party on the same night. We both had bands, and the bands alternated playing, and people went back and forth between the two houses. It was great. We had a great time.
Well, and for those that are younger, probably my generation and up, for those of you that don't know, the garage looking building next to Sigma Nu that my freshman year, I think, was the last year that it was open, 2010. That was KA. Then there was Sigma Nu, and we're also talking about a time period where Alpha Sig was on Point Breeze.
Right, right.
Um, Delt and Phi Tau had made their way to Greek Hill, correct? They were up there.
Yes.
SAE's up there. It's a different Greek system.
They
It's not
were.
the system we have
The
now.
betas were downtown too, you know.
I always
uh,
forget about them down in the corner over
right.
there.
But the Ks and SIGs seem to have a really good relationship. In fact, I can remember several of the forget what you call it, pledge days or what have you.
Mhm.
And we had that area between the houses, and at least one time it was kind of rainy and muddy, but we'd have like wrestling matches going on with us between the two houses out in the mud. And yeah, we had a really good, I thought, relationship with Sigma News. That was great.
Now, just from your experience, so you were in Greek life, and we know Greek life now kind of has been it's a deteriorating system across the country because of some of the aspects that go into that. Does it work better at a school like Bethany, that small school where it is kind of hard to get a lot of involvement otherwise, besides getting involved in Greek or student government or whatever that is? Is that kind of the system for Greek life now, where those small schools are going to be more popular, or where do you see that system?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. I do think Greek life is important, especially for small colleges like Bethany College. But from my own experience, I sort of had this independent stream going on. So I was a KA, as I told you, but
Mhm.
I was also an RA, a resident advisor, for 2 years. So I kind of was in and out, if you will, because of that. Because when you were an RA, you lived with the freshmen in those days. I could probably still today. But yeah, Greek life is important, and I think actually probably more important now for Bethany College, given that times have changed. I mean,
Mhm.
besides the fact that the school is smaller, in my day, you could drink alcohol at the age of 18, and frankly speaking, even at 17, nobody blinked an eye. So there was that, and there were the bars in town. There were two bars in town. One was Frank's, which was then called Bubba's, and then the Bison Inn or something like that.
Mhm.
Then there was another one just across the street and down the road a little bit called the Wooden Keg,
Next to the
which burned
laundromat,
down at some point. Sorry?
right? Right next to the laundromat. Wasn't there a
Yes,
laundromat? And
yes,
then
yes, yes. Yep,
where the
yep.
faculty housing is now on Main Street.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. So when I started, there were two bars in town. There was a gas station in town. And there were almost twice as many students. So it was a little more lively and vibrant. And of course, there was the Greek life, but the independents also had a lot of stuff going on.
Mhm.
That said, I think given the way it is today, with fewer students, without as many places students can go and hang out, I think Greek life is even more important.
So academically, you said you were looking at history, and that communication thing was over there, but we weren't sure about it. What pushed you over the edge? Because you end up being, I believe, the sports editor for, or the sports director for WVBC, I believe.
Well, I was the sports editor for the Tower, the
Ah,
newspaper, which Bethany had in those days, a printed newspaper. In fact, I followed Dave Sims, who I know you've interviewed before. Dave was also a KA. So after Dave was the sports editor, the baton passed to me, and then I passed it to another KA. But in any event, well, really two things. On the one hand, I still like American history, and I've got books about founding fathers and America, all sorts of things related to the U.S. In fact, and I just read about Eleanor Roosevelt. I love biographies. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington,
yeah.
Alexander Hamilton, the list goes on and on. But in any event, I liked history a lot and still do. Although, to tell you the truth, when I took history classes at Bethany, it was one of the rare instances where I liked reading the textbook better than I liked sitting in class and listening to the professor. Now, I don't want to begrudge anyone, but I just didn't think the professors were all that stimulating, and I liked the books better than the classes.
Yeah.
That said, I also kind of had this thing in the back of my head that maybe I'd like to be a journalist. I thought I was a halfway decent writer. I liked the opportunity to learn about broadcasting, radio, and TV. These were days before social media, of course. And the more I got into it, the more I thought, this probably makes more sense for me. I think I can do this.
Mhm.
There were some terrific internship opportunities. There was a very tough chairman of the department in those days, Jim Carty. But that said, once you got past like that freshman and sophomore year, if you hung in there, Jim became your best advocate. And he helped me get some wonderful internships, including one at J. Walter Thompson, the advertising agency in New York City. And frankly speaking, that's where I started my career after graduating from Bethany. So, I kind of got that bug. And then it was really a choice between, well, do I go more into the journalistic side of communications, whether it's broadcasting or print or what have you,
Mhm.
or more into the marketing, the advertising and public relations end of it, which is ultimately what I chose, but I probably could have gone either way
And what
at the
pushed
time.
you that way?
Well, I think what pushed me that way was the opportunity to influence an organization's behavior. And I think being in public relations, which is where I ended up in corporate communications, besides the communications part of it externally,
Mhm.
as you grow and advance in your career, you indeed have an opportunity to influence not only what an organization has to say and communicate, but also what does it do and how does it behave. And that kind of got me going, more so, I guess, than being a journalist reporting on what others were doing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That makes
So I
sense.
think that was the distinction for me.
Well, it's funny you bring up that word, because we're at that point where we got to talk about that dang test that connects all of us Bethany alums. It's a test that I think people right around the January area, and then right around people start seeing blue books in their dreams, comps. So
Yeah.
what was, because if I'm not mistaken, comps for you were, you did the writtens, you did the orals, but you didn't walk out of orals and know that you passed comps, right? You had to wait for the registrar to send you a letter that said you passed, or you didn't get the letter, correct?
You know, I honestly don't remember. I know I passed because I did graduate. But the thing about comps, it proved very valuable because after I graduated, or even while I graduated, I went through a number of situations in my early days of my career and even later days in my career where I had to do, exercises to get, like, for example, the APR distinction for public relations, accredited public relations. You have to take a full day written exam and you have to go through an oral exam with 3 distinguished professionals.
Sounds
And
familiar.
it was very much like the comp experience I had at Bethany. So it really prepared me well for that. And then later, toward the latter part of my career, when I transitioned into academia as a professor, I came here to UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I found myself being interviewed at the same time by like half a dozen faculty members. So there were some experiences with the comps that were very valuable, not just at the moment, but going through life and my career, that I greatly appreciate.
Now, is that something that gets lost when you're in that moment, or because I'm sure as a trustee, you heard it a bunch. Maybe we need to get rid of comps or whatever. But as somebody that went through it, you have that experience where, well, no, comps, yeah, they make sure that we can validate that you knew what you learned something here to earn this degree. But when you're going to go into the real world, that's what you're going to deal with, is that type of interview style, that type of, it's not a one-on-one. It's normally 2 or 3 people that want to talk to you.
Yes.
And so, and is that the benefit that comes with the comprehensive exam?
Well, it was certainly a benefit for me, as I just pointed out. And I didn't appreciate it as much at the time.
No.
But as I moved on in my career and my life, I definitely valued that experience. One of the funny things I remember about comps was in the orals. Of course, I had 2 professors from the communications department, but one was from political science / history. And his name was Dr. Lozier. And we got into that comp oral discussion, which I really ended up enjoying because it was more of a conversation, if you will.
Mhm.
But Evan, he said to me, "Gee, I thought you were a political science major." I said, no, I'm a communications major. So, but I did at Bethany take some political science and history courses. As I told you, I like that area. So that stood out for me. Of course, now I'm excited to see what they do today, where the students come out of comps and they learn whether they passed or maybe even passed with distinction. And then they have fellow students and even family members there to greet them and celebrate, which I think is a great new tradition at Bethany College.
And it's a very unique situation because, that build up to everybody I've been on both sides, I came through the door and got the congratulations thing, but I was also on the side of waiting for people to come out. I think we were just as nervous on the outside waiting for someone to come out as the person on the inside that's actually going to pass the test.
Yeah, we didn't have that then. And I guess to your original question, I guess that must then say, yeah, we didn't really know whether we passed or failed for some days afterwards. Just probably went back to the KA house or up to the bar and had a few beers just to be relieved that it was over, frankly.
Well, so when you walk across the stage, you said you had that your future job was an internship that you had received or worked with at your time. How do you end up back at it's JWT, correct? What's
it's one of the old line famous ad agencies, JWT or J. Walter Thompson. Today it's merged with another company, so it has a somewhat different name. I think it's Wonderman JWT or something like that. But in any event, I had the opportunity, thanks to Jim Carty and the alum who worked at JWT at the time, to be part of a small group of 3 folks who interned as copywriters, advertising copywriters there in their New York office. And I did that they used to have January term, which I thought was a great thing, by the way, because you could do an internship or get a part-time job even for a whole month before going back to college.
Yep.
February. The downside was maybe the second semester extended a little bit longer than it does today, but I thought January term was terrific, and I vote for bringing it back. But nevertheless,
I agree.
yeah, that's what I did one January, and unfortunately, though, my appendix burst during the course of that internship, so I didn't complete it. Although Mr. Carty gave me credit for it, nevertheless, but it was a good experience, and it was something that I used to get a position at J. Walter Thompson as a trainee in the public relations department upon graduating from Bethany. So I'm sure it had a lot to do with my opportunity to do that, and then over, of course, my career, I focused more on the public relations side than the advertising side. But yeah, that was great. I went to this tiny little college in West Virginia, and here I got a cool internship at this massive, famous ad agency in New York City. It was great.
Well, and then from there, you're there, I believe, if I read the LinkedIn resume correct, you're there for about 3 years, 3.5 years, roughly. You move on from there, and then the next move on, and I guess what would be the big, and not that any of those were small, any of your jobs were small, but the big move on the PR side would have had to be Sony, correct?
Well, ultimately, yeah. So I spent probably 9 or 10 years altogether, maybe a little longer, 12 in JWT, and then also another PR firm called Creamer Dixon Bassford, which has another name these days. But I spent a lot of time on the agency side, rose to a senior vice president level. Most of it was in New York, but my last position was heading up an office actually in Pittsburgh for this agency.
Oh.
And then I also worked on Wall Street in New York for investment companies who are no longer with us, but were infamous in their day, E.F. Hutton and Drexel Burnham Lambert. But from there, I did go to Sony. And Sony is where I spent the largest amount of my career, almost 20 years. And ultimately at Sony, heading the US electronics business for Sony Corporation. It's public relations and corporate communications. So did that both based on the East Coast in New Jersey, and then on the West Coast in San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, moved on to a startup company called Cavario, which was.
I was going to say right before there. Am I right that I saw Michigan? There's a Michigan alum for you as well through Sony, correct?
Yes, yeah. While I was at Sony, I was selected to participate in this executive education program or management program at the University of Michigan. Yeah, that was great. That was.
And then you talked a little bit about the accredited public relations. How did that come about?
Well, I think it is still the case today, but you had to be in the profession for 5 years.
Okay.
Also, you had to be a member of the Public Relations Society of America, which is the largest professional organization for PR folks. And then you basically signed up to say, yes, I'd like to take this exam with the goal of becoming an accredited public relations professional, which is like a certification, if you will, that distinguishes you in the field. And you have to study for it and what have you. And I did, and I was fortunate enough to do that and get that accreditation. Actually, I think within 5 years, it was one of the first things I strove to do upon hitting that 5-year mark in my career. And I'd recommend it for anybody who's in the field of public relations.
And then from Sony, we go to the startup. Now, I just wanted to make sure we covered.
Yeah. Well, that's when I was in California. And of course, California is big into tech and into startups and into media. Mm-hmm. And so that was, it was a good experience to go from a large global corporation to essentially a startup and be on the ground floor of something that was basic. It was in the digital marketing, search engine marketing, in that space, if you will. And I headed PR for that relatively small company, especially compared to Sony. but we did I think, a pretty good job to the point where the firm was acquired, which is what the goal was of the founders and the board, so that essentially they could cash out and
Mhm.
receive huge payoffs for basically, selling their firm. And in my role, I was fortunate that I also had some stock participation and was compensated well as a result of that activity. So that by then, I guess I was about 60 years old, and that's then when I made the transition to academia of all
So that's
things.
the pivot to becoming a professor and being more on the academic side of things.
Yeah, yeah, that was sort of an interesting thing because so I'd done that. I'd worked for agencies, I worked for a huge multinational corporation, I worked for a startup. So now what am I going to do at 60? I felt like I was too young to retire. I wasn't really ready to do that. And my brother Ed worked. He's now retired, but he worked for a big insurance company, and their communications director shared a posting for the University of North Carolina that was looking for what they called a professor of the practice to join their faculty
Mhm.
and teach public relations and related classes. And I kind of on a flyer sent in my resume and background information. And lo and behold, one day I was going into a doctor's office and I had a call from one of the associate deans who said, we looked at your information. We'd like you to come visit us in Chapel Hill and talk with you. And frankly, I wasn't counting on it because I don't have a master's degree. I don't have a higher degree. I have obviously the bachelor's degree from Bethany.
Mhm.
So I wasn't counting on it, but I said, gee, this would be really cool if they're serious. And turns out they asked me to join them. And I really did enjoy serving in that role for 3.5 years.
And
Uh,
then why the choice? I've had a couple former or alumni who then became teachers, obviously Ken Morgan, Gary Capel. Why the choice to come back to Brooke County, West Virginia? I mean, obviously you did it in a twofold too, because you become faculty, you're a board of trustee member. I mean, you're really giving back on both angles.
yeah.
Why that why Bethany? Why come back to it?
Yeah, well, it goes without saying, I love Bethany. And like you said, I was a trustee for about 11 years. Oh, beginning in my time at Sony and through the time I was with Covario and even into my time at UNC as a professor here in Chapel Hill. So that was all happening. My position in UNC was on a contract, so it had a certain term,
Mhm.
3 years. We extended it to 3.5. And even at that point, I guess in my office at UNC, among other things, I had a pennant on the wall, Bethany College. I was looking at that one day and I thought, gee, it'd be really cool to go full circle and come back to Bethany and perhaps serve as a visiting professor. So I reached out both to Emmy Gamble, who was the chair of the communications department at the time, as well as to Tamara Rodenberg, the president, who she was also the president of Bethany then, and just said, look, if you're interested, I'd love to come back to Bethany College and kind of finish my career there as a visiting professor in the communications and media arts department. And it ended up working out that way, that they accommodated that. And I'm very grateful that they did. And I love my experience
Mhm.
teaching here at UNC in Chapel Hill, but I also enjoyed immensely my experience at Bethany again as a visiting professor.
So let me ask you this. You've kind of had a resurgence in the alumni world for the town halls and whatnot. You were the moderator for two of them, I believe.
Well,
One of
I
them
think
for
I hosted what might have been the first one with Ken Beto, the
yes.
current chair of the board of trustees, and I appreciate Ken for agreeing to do that. It was one of the first things I did after retiring and seeing what was happening. And I just reached out to Ken and say, Ken, I think there needs to be some communication at this stage, and it should come from you because Dr. Rodenberg had retired,
Mhm.
and there was a new interim president who's still there, of course. But there were a lot of questions and concerns that were being expressed in social media, and it just occurred to me that I think Ken, as the chair of the board of trustees, should communicate and answer questions and deal with some of the issues that people were concerned about. So he agreed, and so did the alumni council, and so that kind of started it off. And of course, they've continued, which is I'm glad to see.
Well, and I think that's, I think, and speaking from my side of the alumni base, I'm not going to speak for the older generations. I think that's really all everybody wanted at this point is just, you got to tell us what's going on so
Yeah.
that we can get the ball rolling in the right direction. And yeah, there's blame to be placed wherever you want to blame it, but we could sit and blame and not do anything. Or as long as we're in this constant communication, there seems to be at least hope now and a progression towards a goal, and not just kind of spinning the wheel in the mud, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And my sense is that the current leadership of the college, both the administration as well as the trustees, are very, they've kind of gotten religion. They're open to the idea of being more communicative and also sharing the challenges, the opportunities, and what they're up against, where alums can help. So I think you're right. I think, people are hungry, alumni are hungry for feedback to say, okay, we're concerned. What can we do to help? Just talk to us. Let us know. Let's put something together.
And then lastly, because you are a PR guy, an accredited PR guy, if you were going to give a pitch, why Bethany, to a current college student, or maybe you're not talking to the student, you're talking to the parents, why Bethany College today?
Yeah, and hey, this is easy for me because not only did I meet my wife at Bethany, she's also a grad, Mary. My daughter went to Bethany, Jenna, and she graduated in 2015. And when I was giving the pitch to her, and part of it was, look, Jenna, you can go to this tiny little college in West Virginia, but you can see the world from Bethany. And she did. She went to China, she went to Germany, she went to Mexico, she went to Great Britain, she went to Italy, she went to Spain, she went to Puerto Rico, all during the time she was at Bethany College. She also majored in communications. But that said, she ended up then going from there to get a master's degree at UNC in Greensboro in higher ed, and now she works at Virginia Commonwealth University. But she had a wonderful experience. She made some great friends. She learned a lot, not just in her major, but in other areas like art. She spent some time with Ken Morgan, who the former head of the art department. I mean, she spent time with Anju Ramji, the head of the business department, who's now the provost. I mean, she got inputs and learnings from all sorts of different people beyond her major, and she made wonderful friends that she continues to have today. She felt comfortable, she felt safe, she traveled the world, she learned a lot, and she's become just a lovely young woman, and I think that could be true for almost anybody who went to Bethany College.
I think that's perfectly said. I mean, Bethany really gives you the chance to be you and find you, kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and look at the opportunities. People can come right in, maybe like yourself, they could start broadcasting baseball games and football games. They can do production. They can do internships. They can explore different areas that maybe they didn't know they even had an interest in. For example, I explored fields like psychology, English literature, and I actually enjoyed them a lot, in addition to the history and the communications and what have you. And then the social life was great too, and I hope that continues. I think that's a little bit of a challenge now, just given the realities of the school and the size and what have you. But I think it's a fine college, and I'm glad to see the renewed emphasis on recruiting students who are perhaps more academically minded.
Mhm.
these days, and that's a good thing. I mean, I taught there for a couple of years, and I had some terrific students, and a couple of them, some of them were quite competitive with the students I had at UNC in Chapel Hill. So, yeah, I think the world of Bethany.
Well, and I think that's a perfect place I want to say thank you for taking time out of your day, joining us from, and I'm going to make sure Frankie Taw hears me clearly, the actual school in North Carolina and not that school down the road.
That's right. That's right.
This has been Rick Clancy, class of 1976. I'm Carlo Guadagnino. This has been the Dingo Talk Alumni Tour. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Wisdom, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. The only place you have to look or type something differently is Instagram. You need to put an underscore between Dingo and Talk. If not, you're going to get a bunch of pictures of wild dogs. It's not me. I don't do that in my free time. But we're here every Thursday, 10 a.m. On YouTube. It goes out the night before on Spotify at 12 midnight. So we'll catch you next week, Chuckleheads. Again, I am Carlo Guadagnino, Rick Clancy, class of 1976 from Bethany College, and we'll see you next week.